Hi, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to the latest edition of the Omohundro Institute's Coffee House. I'm Jim Ambuski. Usually I'm here with Martha Howard. Unfortunately, she cannot join us today, so you just have to deal with me. But you won't have to hear from me long, thank goodness, because we are very delighted to have with us Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson of Johns Hopkins University and an entire team from the excellent project Keywords for Black Louisiana, which we'll be hearing more about today. Dr. Johnson, please take it away.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to come and chat with you from Keywords Black Louisiana, K4BL, keywordsblacklouisiana.org. Before we even get started, of course, we want to acknowledge the Indigenous folks. These are incredibly important steps in just making sure that we're kind of grounded in the land and the place. And these are directly from the College of William and Mary. We also, of course, acknowledge that enslaved people came to William and Mary through several channels and also are part of that history as well. I want to ask all the team to say hello before we get into some of the nuts and bolts. So I am Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson, Associate Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. I'm Director of Life Code Digital Humanities Against Enclosure, writer, historian, study histories of slavery and diaspora, and excited to be founding director and editor-in-chief of Keywords Black Louisiana. Dr. Garcia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. I'm Dr. Guadalupe Garcia, and I am an associate professor at the University of California, San Diego, and also managing editor for Keywords for Black Louisiana.
Kaylee.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us and being here. I'm Kaylee Coleman. I'm a PhD candidate in Latin American Studies and Art History down here in New Orleans at Tulane University. I'm an associate editor on Keywords for Black Louisiana and the Spanish language team lead. Thrilled to be here with you all, so I can pass it along to Deja.
Thanks, Kaylee. Hi, everyone. I'm Deja Yisrael. I'm a second-year Master of International Development Policy student at Georgetown University in DC, and I am the assistant editor for the French team.
Fantastic. And so we'll give a little bit of an overview. I won't talk too long. I'm just going to speed through the obligatory context and everything. Of course, we want to think about our grounding in the space that is Louisiana, the space of the Gulf South. We always want to acknowledge, of course, the long legacy of disaster, of resilience, of resistance, of all of these different things. And we also always want to kind of start with acknowledging that Black people fill slavery's archive, that understanding Black stories are really, really key to how we even came together as a project and began this journey. Keywords Black Louisiana is within an ecosystem of labs and projects called Life Code Digital Humanities Against Enclosure, which you can see pictured here as far as our sort of 2026 iteration. It was founded in 2020 in the midst of pandemic and protests by myself and Dr. Christina Thomas, who at the time was a graduate student and is off doing amazing, amazing things. We have been lucky and humbled to win multiple awards, both for Life Code and other labs like Dayet Electromariage. And we are the winner of the 2025 Digital Projects Legacy Award from the American Studies Association. And we have an array of principles and ways that we stand. But the long story short is that we're an anti-racist and decolonial collective that is doing digital humanities against enclosure. So we're explicitly trying to speak against all the enclosures, slavery, colonialism, empire, everything. And take inspiration from the natural world. And right now, one of the things that Life Code is rooted in is the mangrove. We also have a number of guides. So we are a multi-institutional ecosystem. We have 9 guides. We are at institutions around the world at this point, moving now to Cambridge as well. And we also have about 200 members, labs, and projects sort of across the board. And we've had an incredible amount of success graduating folks into graduate programs. We've had a 100% success rate with graduate students at postdoc and tenure track jobs. The Keywords Black Louisiana journey has been part of that from the very beginning, which is why I like to lay all of that out. It was founded in 2020. It is now a collective of researchers, scholars, culture bearers, artists, activists, students who are thinking about how to create digital portals into the Black history of the Gulf Coast. Keywords Black Louisiana that we're presenting to today focuses on 18th century French and Spanish documents. And we can really think about how we kicked off this particular iteration with our NHPRC planning grant phase, National Historical Publications, and Records Commission. I always get one of those a little bit off. where we began actively building a community-engaged digital edition. I should be clear, this is an idea that was in the formation between in my own work, but also with Daryl Meadows since like 2017, and thinking about what can the digital humanities offer, histories of early America, colonialism, empire, slavery, but it was receiving the NHPRC grant that really set us on this track and gave us the support that we needed to expand in amazing ways, to have this partnership with the New Orleans Jazz Museum, which is the current digital corpus of documents that we pull from, and to begin to create what we call our bias set, which is an amazing data set of keywords, of abstracts, and that tracks the different documents and is where we kind of, begin to kind of reimagine both the digital, but also really hone in on enslaved people and their stories in the documents of the 18th century archive. We use Google Docs as a kind of grounding. We'll get deeply into our transcription and translation process in just a moment. And we, build out these dense transcriptions and translations that allow us to really hone in on who are enslaved people in the archive. I just wanted to put a note here about our subject matter specialists who have been so instrumental to our internal process of peer review, which we can talk about more in conversation. But I especially want to note Sophie White, who also has a project here with Omohundro, the Voices of the Enslaved, and is of course absolutely brilliant. Lucetta Costa Corneal, Melanie Lamotte, and Jennifer Spear. And then some pictures, because we are also a community, we are a collective. We do believe in intergenerational work, but also in the community engaged and community-based work. When Dr. Adelaide Raj talked about the community team and the work that we do on the ground, our teaching team working on K through 12 curriculum, and Zaria, who is our digital curation lead, as you see here, Deja Israel, who will speak a little bit about the work that she's doing on French team, and the various kinds of editorial collective work that we have been up to. I think that I'm going to pass it on to our first team member, who is going to take it over and take it away from me. That's enough context for you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. We'll tell you about how this work actually happens, how we get our transcriptions and translations from the digitized colonial archive at the Louisiana Historical Collection into our K4BL website. Every document in our data set, which we affectionately call the bias set, because every document is selected from the LHC Colonial Digital Archive following a set of criteria that signal involvement with Black or Indigenous life. So they all start in LHC, someone selects them and pulls them into our bias set. Then the language teams transcribe and translate the documents from French and Spanish into modern English. From there, we pass it on to the editorial team who reviews, revises, and builds out this context. And then the digital team prepares the document and the end user engagements that we've seen in some of the previous slides. In the next slide, you'll see a visualization of our language team workflow. So we'll tell you more in detail about each step in the slides to come. But to start you off, each document is first touched by who we call our initial greeter. This is someone on the research team who's familiar with the LHC Colonial Archive and is very confident in our criteria that Kaylee will explain later. They create a bias set entry, which includes the metadata of a repaired title. That means one that doesn't replicate the harms of the original title, a repaired abstract, as well as the document identification. That's like the ID numbers. Then a document selector, someone on the language team, chooses a document from this bias set and pulls it into our language team workflow. They might choose a document based on research team conversations we have in our weekly meetings or something that aligns with their personal work. And they prepare a Google document with the metadata again, a link to the digitized manuscript, and two sections, one for transcription and one for translation. And we saw that in some of the previous slides. From there, they let the team know via Slack or whichever way we're communicating at the time that the document's ready for the iterative transcription translation process, and we'll talk more about that. Once we've worked through the technical decisions of the paleography and the translations, we zoom out into more of a narrative building stage, thinking about what this document tells us about Black life in Louisiana. That looks like revisiting the title, the abstract, adding footnotes, endnotes. These things go to editorial, and from editorial we go to digital. I'll pass it to Kaylee to talk more in detail about those steps.
Thank you, Deja. So we'll start here. We'll do a little walkthrough of a sample document to show you all a little bit of what this looks like. Right here, we've got a document that we've been working on this semester. And the repair title that we've opted into is Did Carlotta Set Fire to Her Enslaver's House? And it's a couple of documents actually that surround a 13-year-old girl named Carlotta who's been accused of setting fire to her enslaver's house. A multi sort of plantation, an abode, fire ensues. But I want to start us here to remind us and reground us in what Dr. Johnson said earlier about our keywords for Black Louisiana alignments and principles. And so as many of us know here, and as Dr. Johnson has highlighted, this project very much so is situated in foregrounding and engaging African descended people in the past in Louisiana throughout these documents. We understand that the past opens doors to reimagining our histories, to envision different futures, and to build new solidarities and points of connection, to bridge gaps across diaspora, and to turn an ear to a plethora of often marginalized voices and perspectives. Documents such as this document, the Carlotta Doc, allow us to do that. So to walk us through a little bit the steps, as Deja pointed out, first and foremost comes the initial greeting and then the doc selection. We have pretty strict criteria that are in alignment with our alignments, as we talked about earlier, of surrounding Black history, anti-fascism, anti-racism. But here are some of our criteria for identifying if documents in that Louisiana Historical Center database belong within our bias set. So here are some of the potential criteria for inclusion in the bias set. One is if the document references African and people of African descent, including references to people via names, numbers, nouns, descriptions, pronouns, etc. Another criteria is if the document references topics that are relevant to Africans and people of African descent during the respective the respective time period, colonial Louisiana. So such as documents surrounding the Code Noir, slave trade regulations, things like that. Another sort of stipulation if the document will fit into our bias set is if the document makes references that relate to a doc that's already in the bias set or one that's already been identified as related to Africans and people of African descent, even if that doc doesn't contain discrete references itself. Another criteria is if the doc references a topic relevant to Black life in Gulf Coast Louisiana that's been identified by our Keywords Community Circle Advisory Board as a topic of urgent need or interest. So as Dr. Johnson pointed out earlier, it's not just our research team. We have many teams. We also have our subject matter specialists who are top of their fields, sort of academics working in this area, and also our robust Keywords Community Circle Advisory Board that's built out, I think now of 19 Black public historians in Louisiana, museum professionals, tour guides, genealogists, educators, who also very much so not just respond to the work that we do, but actually dictate out the work that we do, dictate out the sort of deliverables that we make. It's a very iterative process and workflow. So those are some of the criteria. If the document that's been encountered by the initial greeter meets some of these criteria, it's entered into our bias set where it does face another round of review. So no document only has one set of eyes on it at any point in time. So another person has to review it and say, this does actually meet that criteria. If it doesn't meet that criteria, it's not forgotten about. It's entered into our discard set where it again meets another round of review to say this does not meet our criteria for inclusion in this bias set. After the document has been greeted and entered into our bias set, it also goes through a round of doc selection. By this set, I mean not every document that goes into our bias set will be translated and transcribed at that particular time, and maybe not for a long time. The point of the project is understanding that we are inputting as much as we can and with care and slow care and research, transcribe and translate as we can, but that more will exist in the bias set essentially and then gets fully transcribed and translated. I say this because when the doc enters the transcription and translation period, it goes through another rigorous set of criteria, essentially surrounding around the idea of, is this document, is it urgently needed to transcribe and translate right now? Understanding that there's more than we can do in this moment. So there's a whole robust set of criteria there. I won't go too in depth right now for time's sake, but generally speaking, surrounding urgency, and also surrounding, does this document serve questions that the Community Circle Advisory Board has asked us to address at this particular moment in time? As you can see right here, here's a bit about how that Google Doc looks that Deja pointed out earlier. So we work in working docs, we work asynchronously. So folks on the language teams and the research teams are in many different locations. We'll get back to how that work happens a little bit in Deja's next slide, but just so you can see, we work on these docs together. The diplomatic transcription goes on the left side and the translation goes on the right. The diplomatic transcription, we lean as much as possible into doing it as accurately as letter for letter as possible to the actual scan. But in the translation, there's always an editorial process, always a consideration of legibility and accessibility in relation to accuracies. And we'll get more to that. But so you can see here a bit of example of how this actually looks as we engage in it.
Thanks, Kaylee. Yeah, so to build off of this asynchronous process that Kaylee just described, an important part of the process is what we call Power Hour. This is a weekly meeting where French and language team members gather in a virtual room, really to touch base about the things we've discussed asynchronously, resolve comments, troubleshoot tricky transcription or translation. So a few of the things we use this time for. First and foremost is to fellowship and check in. It's important to approach the work as people first and remember that we're engaging with real lives, past and present. And this allows us to practice community among ourselves as we are a community engaged project. We also discussed the historical context using reading suggested by our subject matter specialist or in our K4BL resources folder. This allows us to gain understanding on phrases that have specific 18th century contextual meaning, perhaps positions in government, things of that nature. We talk about questions and disagreements on how to translate the significance or meaning of an 18th century phrase into modern English. And we resolve those comments that we've left for each other throughout the week. And this process has us return to the transcription. Sometimes the transcribers will return to the translation and consider, well, maybe that doesn't actually make sense in this context. Can we try this phrasing instead? And all of this conversation creates really beautiful and profound lessons that come organically from all of our different positionalities and perspectives that we sometimes then build out into a story set, which I don't know if we'll have time to discuss, but just wanted to mention those.
Thank you for that, Deja. And before we move on, something worth re-mentioning is that in the language teams, in all of our team structures, but also in language teams, we have folks at pretty much every level of the sort of educational pipeline, but also outside of institutional pipelines too. So we've got early stage undergrads coming in as translators, we call 2T sort of translators. We've got advanced undergraduates who've been on the team for a few years. We usually reference that as upboarding into transcription once they're more grounded in the work and more familiarized with the language and the paleography. We have early stage graduate students, advanced graduate students, faculty. So we have a really robust and sort of anti-hierarchical network of checks and balances. So we're consistently engaged in upboarding our students into the skills they need, regrounding all of ourselves in colonial Louisiana history, Black colonial Louisiana history, Black history in general. And so I just wanted to sort of point that out because I think we, for sake of time, skip through some slides, but that's really integral to how the project operates as a whole. And Deja and I will pass this over to Dr. Garcia, who's our managing editor, to talk through some of the editorial stuff, but just sort of walk you through how, so once the documents have moved through the language team powers hours, once they're ready for editorial review, they go on to our subject matter specialist and then to our editor-in-chief, Dr. Johnson, and our managing editor, Dr. Garcia, for final review before they go to our community circle advisory board during our summer workshops, and then eventually to the website. So it's a really robust system of review. But you can see a bit here how the editorial review works. And just so you know, some of the things that come up for us a lot in our editorial review are questions like, are we opting into footnotes or endnotes? And actually, how are they functioning as containers? Are they chasing historiographies? Are they providing historical context? Are they explaining out terms that we decide to leave untranslated? Because that's one of our big editorial conversations, research and editorial conversations, actually what words don't get translated because either they would lose something so sort of profound in their translation that they would either recreate a harm or lose something potent about their actual sort of meaning. So what are the footnotes? What are the endnotes doing? And again, sort of going back and forth with those questions of legibility and accessibility. But I want to pass along to Dr. Garcia to talk about our editorial process.
Thank you, Kaylee and Deja and everybody. And first, I just want to say that I'm just so thrilled to be here and to listen to Kaylee and Deja speak. All of our training happens inside of the power hours, inside of these digital spaces. And most of these students that Kaylee just mentioned, whether they be undergraduates, graduate students, et cetera, come in with almost no training at all. And so they're not historians. They're not in the documents. They're definitely not in 18th century Spanish colonial documents. And so everything that you're seeing now has literally been built by the ground up by the students. Our editorial process, we scaffold in a process of peer review, and that's where our subject matter specialists come in. So that's what Dr. Johnson mentioned earlier is we have people who are in the French documents, who have been in the French documents, have been in the Spanish documents, have been in the Louisiana documents. And so we're really bringing together everybody's expertise. And one of the things that has been so absolutely humbling for me as a historian is to see the conversations. And this is really where the lively academic conversations take place, is during these matter specialist editorial meetings that happen in the spring and in the fall as we get ready to go into our August workshops where we really are speaking to the community and listening to the community. And so we do that after these documents have gone through the entire process of vetting. So to go back to what Kaylee said, once our students are working through the documents in these power hours. The communication happens over Slack usually, and in those power hours. And so there's a question about a word, about a practice, whether, how we mark off pages, for example. So it's really the minutia as well that our best practices are addressing. And the best practices have kind of grown organically as the teams have also developed according to expertise, to need, to the questions that really the students have had as they're going through the transcriptions and the translations. And so somebody might ask, how do we mark pages? What do we do about words that we need to translate? Do we translate all words, or are there some words that just don't have translations that we can put forward? And so once the students are done with them, our assistant and associate editors will kick the document up, and Dr. Johnson will take a look at the document. I might come in and take a look at the document, and then they go to our subject matter specialist as we have done everything that we can possibly do with these documents. We have had conversations and discussions and debates on Slack, and now we would like all of you to weigh in and perhaps tell us what you do. Our subject matter specialists also love to geek out over the documents. And so they themselves might say, well, that's really interesting because I do this completely different thing. And in my part of the world in the 18th century, this is what that word means. And so out of those meetings have grown things like workshops on what notarial practices were in the 18th century, how the history of the book develops. And so it's all really a learning experience for the students and also for us. And again, for me, it's been just really humbling to be able to sit around a word, a term, an idea, and have this amazing group of people to talk through. Once our subject matter specialists say, okay, this transcription and translation, we see what you've done. This is great, or we have questions, it gets kicked back down to the team. And so we have to go back into the document and work on it some more. Then it goes back to Power Hour, whatever those issues were get resolved, and then it goes up to Dr. Johnson for final review before we send it up to our digital assistants as well, for markup. And some of these conversations around best practices are also the product of thinking about how to represent the document on the digital level, right? What we can do digitally to put those documents online that we wouldn't necessarily have to think about if they were simply on paper. And so all the process itself has spurred questions that we ask of our best practices, and it really allowed us a space to think about intentionally what we are doing and the decisions that we are making around each word and around each document. So I can go ahead and pass it along to, I believe, community.
Hi, friends. My role here is to explain a little bit of the voices of our community team and advisory board and what that means. And we are the community team of this project is made up of people, meaning the people within the community team, not the community circle and advisory board, are people who are themselves academics, as I am a historian in a university, or academic adjacent. But part of our role on this team is to really think critically about three big goals that at some level both reflect and also sort of contradict all of the very specialized things we've been talking about. And one of the principal ideas of this project is that archives should not be opaque and scary, that there's a lot of trading on expertise within academia, and it is hard work, as we've been discussing, but we want more people to understand that work. And there has been in a lot of, not to sort of shake our fingers, but there's a sense that like, oh, we'll get the information out in the public. But one of the things about this project is to really peel the onion. The archive itself should not be opaque. The second thing, and this goes to watching the students learn the paleography, and one of the questions in the chat about manual transcription is that paleography, those weird historic, legal, and social constructions, they too should not be opaque and specialized and somehow housed and reserved for some limited group of historians. And to be fair, there has been a sense that, well, the general public mostly doesn't want to know that. But I think that contributes to a process of mystification. And one of our roles has been to essentially, in this project, to have a much more sort of naked process. The example I give is there's when you can go into museums and they've got a glass window that shows you like what's inside the walls, whether it's pipes or old masonry. It's that kind of thing that we want it all to be understood, so that when you say, well, this came from so-and-so's notarial archives, you want a general public to understand that, a young woman has come into a notary because she's transferring a piece of property to her recently emancipated brother. And that's actually what that means. I think the third thing that is a big part of our mission is that ordinary Black life is all over the colonial record. And even in a space like New Orleans, where there's a lot of public discussion and sort of tour guide and public history about the colonial era, there's a sort of marketing of amazement of look at this unique, special, fascinating one story of Black life that some historian has found and written a great book and making it too exceptional. And that one of the things that the community is hungry for, and I think that one of the things that we certainly have learned from engaging with our community circle and advisory board is that they've always kind of know people who live everyday life and think about community, they had long suspected, all right, that precisely the kind of stories that are in this colonial record always were there. And the sense that ordinary Black life is all over the colonial archive, and that we should think about one of the most amazing things, and I'm getting ahead of myself, is that when one of our initiatives were to take what we call the street team, teams of students out to public places to explain the project to people. And people who are local to New Orleans, they knew that there were colonial records, all right, in what is sort of the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Museum. They knew those records were there. And then they looked at these stories and they said, wait, those things are in there? So these were kind of well-informed, historically engaged people. And that is actually what our mission has been, to essentially get wider spread knowledge, not just of the stories themselves, but the fact that they are literally too numerous to count. And so we have done that through one big structural thing. All of the work teams that have been speaking so far are based all over the country. The community team is based in New Orleans because we are Black focused, we are descendant focused, and we are focused in the community where these lives were lived. While we are historians, and we have actually on our team, Dr. Wendy Godin, someone who's an expert in the sort of Black Louisiana diaspora across North America from the 1800s to the present, the community in which these stories are talked about, all right, and the people who practice Black history here, they're the first audience for this material. And if we don't develop this project in a way that makes sense to them, that feels responsible, ethical, and interesting and useful to them, then we will have failed. And so at the front end of this project, what we put together, and that's in the picture that you're seeing, a team of people who are a mixture of public scholars who are expert writers in their own right. We've got tour guides. We've got members of I think 7 different actual local public history organizations. Many of them straddle sort of being within both state and university institutions. But what distinguishes them is that they are literally practicing public history. And this structural community, what we at the front end, and some of our richest conversations literally happened in the beginning stages when we essentially said to this group, this is the idea we have. How could we do this better? It's in part out of those conversations, and I don't think we've gotten to what it means to actually write a narrative story and the story set, sort of in terms of fleshing this out. So it wasn't just, great, thank you, you're translating and transcribing things, because all of us are not trilingual and our audiences are not. They were very much, let's think through, all right, both what a narrative story would and should feel like, but also very specific questions, what kinds of stories they were captivated by. One of the things that is sort of near and dear to my heart is that it is actually out of this group that one of our stories, this is Mama Kumba gumbo, and they're like, people ask us about gumbo all the time and they want to talk about it, but talk about it in under-informed ways. And so one of those stories, they're like, we can use that so readily to get the level of archivally based understanding of ordinary Black life much stronger than the sort of, that's an African thing, maybe we can talk about it, maybe we know something about it. And so this group of people has been in conversation with us from the very beginning. And one of the sort of the signature things that we do in August, and I want to sort of amplify something that Deja said, we do 2 things in our August workshop. One is the actual workshop time where we spend a full day from sort of 9 to after 3, we say on the schedule 9 to 3:30, but it's always 5 when we leave, actually talking about the project and actually developing things. And to give an example of that, one of the things that came up last year, I think, was the real urgency of thinking about mapping and thinking about how we talk about geography for people who both live their lives in these spaces, but also the people they most engage with are interested in the geography. But the other thing we do is we try to get out and about into institutions and archives in New Orleans and beyond, and to do that collectively, to think about the ways all of us, not just sort of professional historians and the many levels of students involved, but this circle as well. And we have gone into, the Mint and into the Colonial Archive where our records are. We've gone into historic New Orleans. We've also gone into other parish archives in Louisiana. And we do that together for two reasons. One, so that we're all engaged in a conversation about the future of this project, but also about the nature of archives and what we all collectively think about the future of the project. The other part of it, though, it goes to what Deja said, is that we are trying to do this in community and build relationships sort of trust and dialogue and understanding with one another. And I would say, as someone now 5 years in, one of the things that's been most powerful for me as someone who lives in New Orleans, works in a university, has done that here for most of the past 20 years, the opportunity to literally spend just about 2.5 days every August in deep conversations with people that I frankly meet in passing at events. That has changed the tenor of the project. It's changed our learning. We all have sort of was it St. Landry parishes are like, when we have this project growing beyond the Colonial Archives of Orleans Parish, that we will thinking bigger about it, so that the visionary experience is done in a very large community. The other thing that we've been able to do, which is, and you're looking at that, and if you are wise, you're skeptical, like, wow, that's a lot of people. There's all sorts of subsets of that. And one of the other commitments we've been able to make is that we try to have a secondary check-in every spring so that we are in regular contact. And this isn't something that happens, that it isn't like a board meeting where we sort of report back. But we also have had members of the team in New Orleans at different times. I think the community focus group, that's the most recent one, talking about the look and feel of the site. I can't believe how many iterations it's been through, and which, is a subset of the team. If we can get, I think our standard is, if we're thinking about major structural changes to anything, to get input from, sort of 2 to 3 people in addition to those gatherings. And it has been sort of our own micro practice of breaking down the walls. The breaking down the wall ethos is an abstract principle of the project, but it's also something that we have done sort of within this working team that has been particularly effective. And I think also sort of one of our hopes, really instructive for the students involved in the project, that they ideally enter a world in which this kind of practice is normative. Many, many, many university origin, because the university based is too strong a word. Many, many, many university origin projects are things that originate and sort of grow all their branches within a university and then sort of go out into communities like, hey, do you like it? And they're very open to being like, no, change it in this way. And we're trying much more to essentially have a thing that grows collectively. I will stop there because I could talk for a very long time.
That is plenty, I feel like, to chew on. As you see, we have plenty of slides to share and showcase, but why don't we open it up for conversation? And we can ask us questions. Yes.
I'll pick up on a thread that Kristen Jacobson asked in the chat about the transcription process. And I feel like a broken record at this point because I feel like I'm bringing this up at every single OI coffee house we've had here in the last year or 15 months or so. But the role of artificial intelligence, and there are some really scary things about it. There are some really potentially great things about it in terms of our workflow. But how are you thinking about that technology or large language models in relation to the work you're doing, particularly with transcription, as that has become more advanced these days and expediting some of that work, but also, to I think some of the points you all made, and they're great points about the struggle you have now, but you could have an even greater effect with artificial intelligence on accurately not only transcribing words, but translating them so that that you get the full effect of the intended meaning, so that you don't lose that. I guess that's a long way of saying, how are you thinking about AI these days?
Sure. We don't use AI for transcription and translation. We have a generally anti-AI policy. Across Life Code, we consider AI a public evil. And we do have a critical AI pillar of folks who are working with AI and thinking through AI, but Keywords is not. And in fact, what we found is that working through the transcription and translations manually has revealed nuances and divergences in language that are not just 18th century to the present day, but also particular to Gulf Coast Louisiana. So it's not uncommon for us to come across documents that are in French that is adapted into Spanish and vice versa. It's not uncommon for us to come across documents that are various iterations of French Creole and Coravini, like other kinds of other languages essentially that are emergent in the discussion. And I know for a fact that we wouldn't find that if we were rooting ourselves in AI, but I also know that along with better accuracy, actually, what we're also finding is that in our power hours, as Deja and Kaylee described, we're finding a stronger sense of community and collectivity so that folks are able to have a low barrier of entry into the paleography and the language transcription and translation, but also they're feeling more empowered as they work together. They're gaining networking and professional development skills. They're creating other kinds of like peer mentoring structures. And so that collectivity and community that we're so grounded in, that Dr. Adderley is describing in community in Louisiana, we're also doing it within the project. And so that process is actually more important to us than getting to either any kind of comprehensive collection of documents from the archive as a whole. So for Keywords, that's probably going to be an anti-AI stance pretty much for a while. I don't see that changing anytime soon. But yeah, Dr. Adderley, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think to the other thing that I will say from, you know, and for full transparency, like my anti-AI thing is somewhere up there. But I think one of our missions here is to render the process of understanding this world and these documents and this language as transparent and as accessible as possible. I think the very act of sending it to AI says this is tedium or this is too difficult. And I think that in addition to the real nuance and interactivity and the fact that I don't think in, you know, any of our lifetimes or the kid born 5 minutes ago's lifetime, we're going to get the nuance we need about sort of colonialism's white supremacist archive out of any AI model. I think we also message a thing about the nature of the process that, oh, we're trying to get to the meat of the stuff, and the process is part of what we're also communicating with not just our community circle and advisory board, but everybody who interacts with this material. I don't know how y'all handle questions, because there's also an ed team question in the chat.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, the research and editorial folks can answer the trial and error about how the workflow. The answer is to all of this is yes. We developed the workflows trial and error. I'm not sure anyone could have envisioned it from the get. And on the community team, one of the trial and error workflows that happened was absolutely, we had for years an idea that what would this look like to make this accessible in we'll say loosely sort of K through 12, but really 8 through 12 spaces. And we've had a very slow gestation of that process, sort of trying ourselves to make connections. But one of our key partners is the Exponential Honors Program at Xavier University of Louisiana, one of our star local HBCUs that also has a pretty strong team of students on their social science side who are pre-education. And through the Exponential Honors Program and its Associate Dean Head, Dr. Sharon Roberts, we have from some of her students, undergraduate students in the Bachelor's of Education track, they made a curricular education team. And essentially, through them, we realized that that's not something that can be a part of community teamwork, that they are on the community side. And they're building out and building relationships and similar process with particular schools that have the bandwidth to embrace the mission of this project. So that's one of our, it's about 2.5 years old, whereas the project itself is, I guess, 5.5. And so it is very much a kind of organic and slow moving thing precisely because of it. And it's also another space in which a lot of professional development has happened and also a lot of leadership from this, sort of new generation of would-be educators coming out of Xavier.
And I think you said it, Dr. Adderley, but I think there was a slide in here too that education team presented at our spring incubator this last year, some of their sample, a rubric, a class design, using some of our documents and stories for various levels of K through 12 education, Louisiana specific, topics that are supposed to be covered at certain levels and grading. So they showed us some of the lessons they had designed, and they were really incredible. And I think we have a slide somewhere back there showing a picture of it.
One of the things actually I wanted to pick back up on Alexander's question about workflow and the sort of give and take and the trial and error. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because as you were talking, I was sort of mapping out your workflow in my head. I mean, you showed it, but then just thinking about the long journey to get there. And you all seem to actually love it a great deal, which is great because I don't think everybody else can say that about their workflows. Like it seems to work really well. So, and of course, that takes commitment from the people to make it work. But can you tell us about some of the failures that you encountered along the way that forced you to make a correction or make a change in that process?
I can pick some of this up. Scheduling, just some of the logistics of the process are difficult, right? When we're working with the number of undergraduates, especially who have the kinds of schedules that they tend to have now with 4 or 5 classes, it becomes really difficult. And power hour is actually the idea of, and I would just remember during this conversation of at the time, one of our associate editors, Dr. Cristina Villarreal, who said, okay, we're going to come up with one hour once a week where everybody gets together and works together collectively, in part because working asynchronously, even though we are digital, for the undergrads who are not trained in the history, right, it becomes overwhelming. And so having other students working alongside of them that they can easily, and you'll see a screen like this with people with headphones on who occasionally will unmute. Sometimes it's 3 people, sometimes it's 5. Sometimes we do it together. So we've tried various iterations of it, and it's really what has worked, and it has grown very much organically out of the students that we have. We change the hour every semester according to the needs of the students. We have tried buddy systems as well, where they work together, and there's always an assistant or associate editor on the power hour so that students can have somebody to come back and say, what do we do with this? Or I'm really lost here. And then the conversation will continue asynchronously on Slack after that for the entirety of the week. And then we meet again during that power hour.
Yeah, I would just add and say that we have that visualization to like help everyone think through, but it's quite flexible. Like our power hours, as Dr. Garcia mentioned, we decide them in the beginning of each semester, and they look different from Spanish to French, and then also depending on who's on the team at the time. So it's really just a time for us to all get together. And then same with the initial greeter and doc selector. We have someone assigned as doc selector, but it's someone who kind of wants to take on that role and feels more confident and comfortable. Initial greeter is someone who's very well versed with our values. So it is a workflow that we stick to, but it lives and breathes with who's on the project and what works best for getting our transcriptions and translations done.
And just to build off that, it's not something that hasn't worked, but it's something that's constantly, I think, being worked out, is that both something we mentioned a lot there at the presentation is the idea that the work moves at the speed of trust and also at the speed of capacity, which is sort of different to how a lot of academic production is expected to happen, But I say all this because I think one of the things that's constantly being worked out is figuring out ways, workflows, structures, and things that the teams are built around the idea that Keywords for Black Louisiana is in the professional development sense. It's meant for students to move through and to seed out and to continue on taking those principles and those foundations that they've learned out into other projects. And so how to create structures where students come in, have this sort of scaffolding to upboard them, and then to upboard them out, to have them seed out, but to maintain some sort of consistency, not just of leadership, which we very much so have, but of consistency of how operations work, how best practices operate, where the documents live, how we do those things. So it's not something that hasn't worked, but it's something that is always in work, I think, is figuring out how to build a structure that is both flexible and living and still has the sort of center trust, but that is meant for students to move in and move out from, if that makes any sense.
I think that makes a great deal of sense. And as you were all talking, and I've been thinking about this during the presentation, the kind of the ways in which this represents a new kind of digital edition. And to your point, Kaylee, thinking about sort of, I think I love the term upboarding, onboarding, upboarding. That makes a great deal of sense to me. So thinking then about what are kind of the key core principles you would all like to see exported or upboarded to other projects or other teams who are thinking about developing a project like this? They've come across a majestic collection or a series of collections somewhere and thinking about how they can actually initiate their own project in this mold.
Great question. I pass that on to the team. Life code principles are clear, so anti-racist, decolonial, against enclosure, all of that. But go ahead.
I think for me, and then I'd love to hear what everyone else says. I think for me, the most pivotal thing that I'd like to see continue being upboard and sort of seeded out is the idea of what Dr. Adderley talked about, that projects like this, even when they include community engagement aspects, they tend to be depository, right? Where they have a community engagement team or community board, but it's sort of like the project happens and it deposits that thing to the community team and says, here, we made this thing for you. But one thing I think that Keywords does very, very successfully is both take the years to build that trust with the communities that we are working with, the community circle advisory board we've composed. Also understand that community is not a monolith, that the asks that come from them are not monolithic and always changing, but really leaning into the iterative process of that, and that we are creating something for specific groups of folks. Our work is not to deposit that, but it's to be an iterative conversation where we hear what's being asked of us, we present something, and then in real fellowship with each other over multiple days and multiple times a year say, is this working for you? Is this the thing that you want? Is this an answer to the question that is asked of us? And if the answer is no, that's okay. Come back to the drawing board, try again. But I think that's actually really different than how most projects operate. And that's what I would like to see most continue on, I think, as folks move to other projects.
I do want to hear y'all's answers to the question about thing power in the chat, because I think it relates to what we are trying to. I do want to hear y'all who are on sort of digital and editorial and translation transcription talk about the coaxing, but also that the thing power, we want everybody, our community circle, but everybody who engages with this project to be in that process of coaxing information and of appreciating that, that power in the documents themselves. And I think that this is about information delivery per se. It is actually very much about that.
I can respond to that because we have been doing some really lovely initial greeting workshops. So something about the initial greeter, it emerged out of a conversation about, as researchers, our encounters with the documents, the page images literally on the screen, right? So to Anne's question, like, what does it mean to encounter people, but also to be encountering them through these objects, which is especially poignant for histories of slavery when you're encountering enslaved people, right? And I'm sure there are other histories that also have this tenets. And so what we found was, as we grew as a project and grew familiar with the documents, really began to understand these as individuals and as communities, as events that are happening, not stories in a book or script on a page, we shifted to thinking about, okay, well, we're not just sort of doing research. I mean, we are, but how can we name the act of research as also in alignment with our principles of being Black-centered and people-centered, right? And so it actually came from a conversation in one of the meetings where I was using the phrase, like the initial capture of the document, initial capture of the record, initial capture of the data. And it was Kaylee who was like, that's kind of weird to say capture about enslaved people. And we're sort of like, oh, shoot, and it's one of those things that you just sort of say, you don't think about capture coming from photography, of course. But it was an opportunity to say, okay, absolutely. That is the thing that we can change. And it actually can change our relationship. That one change our relationship to how we go into that digital archive and how we encounter like things, right? Quote unquote things, how we understand who we're speaking to and why we're speaking to them, Carlota, Catarina, Maria Juana, whoever it might be, and what we are trying to bring out from what is happening in that document. It allows us kind of recenter on the individuals and them as people, not as subjects of history, right? As people who are part of a story that is unfolding. It also was an opportunity, and we didn't quite get to talk about the story set. I think we only have a few minutes left, but there was also opportunity to think about, what does it mean to really meet these individuals in the time and place that they're living, not to be researching sort of over on top of them, but to be understanding in an intimate way, who they are in the document, what their relationship is to other people in the document, entered into the Cabildo and been part of that conversation that was happening. And shout out to Jennifer Spear and Dr. White, who are subject matter specialists, who are also very granular and are like, what did it smell like? Where in the city were they? What is the building like? Is there dust in the air? Is it flooding? Is it hurricane? What's the weather? And so it also is an opportunity to really learn about the lives of individuals and make that like a relation, right? Have a relationship with them in that kind of way. And I don't think as researchers in the academy, we're sort of trained that way. We're trained with a bit more impersonal nature. But I think to actually be in the documents in the way that we are trying to be to truly understand the full texture of the lives that they're living, we had to just make what seems like a small change to initial meeting, initial greeter, to make that change explicit. And those kind of small changes do then add up to, all right, so now we're meeting you. Well, who are you? What do you like? Like, let's have a conversation and let's engage in that kind of way. It's also pedagogically a lot more interesting. So if we're thinking about, okay, how do we have a conversation with folks who are training to be K through 12 teachers, how they might teach the history of slavery, how they might teach the history of enslaved lives, that's a whole different framing from slavery happened to you. And then, am I not a man and a brother? And now you've learned. And I think that that's such an important revision in this moment. And so, yeah, and I guess that speaks to a little bit of like, how do we kind of make these things come alive while also appreciating, and just to make clear that there are boundaries, right? Like the document, we can only go with what's in the document, right? And even as we're thinking about learning these individuals and this moment, we're not making things up. We're not even fabulating. Our transcriptions are diplomatic, our translations are modern, but we don't veer from the text, and we're very careful to be very explicit about this is the thing that is said, this is how we translate, this is what does not translate, and this is what's here on the page, and the documents are still the building blocks of the project. And even within that, we're still able to have this encounter that is I feel like really respectful of what the history is and who these individuals are, and that they are the ancestors of the folks who we're meeting at these community circle and advisory board meetings, who are descendants of the folks who are in the documents.
And to add to that, just really quickly, Dr. Johnson, I know we didn't have much time to talk about the story set, but if folks do look at them on our website, and there'll be more going up in our next upload, just to add to Dr. Johnson's point too about us not even fabulating, the stories even, they're not fabulation, they are using what evidence we have in the documents and what historical context we might know, but to more than anything, not to state or not to fabulate certain things, but to point towards what we see in these docs, what that might lead us to question, what that might lead us to think through. And so it's not a conclusive thing. It's like a gesture towards what might this help us think through.
Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much. Remind us again where folks can check out your site, because people are still here, so I imagine they still want to keep the conversation going, but
Yes.
I have to close the Zoom.
No. Keywords for blacklouisiana.org. We'll take you to the landing site where both sites are, docs.k4bl.org and stories.k4bl.org. So you can go to all of those from there. And we hope that you do check it out. Drop us a line. Let us know what you think, all of it. Thank you so much for having us. This has been amazing.
Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.